Relationship between the United States and Iran tend to be particularly bad. Why is that so? In the previous video, we saw how until the 1970s, Iran was the most loyal ally of the United States in the region. So what led to that breakdown in the relationship between the US and Iran? Well, it's a pretty complicated history that we will study today. In a previous video, we studied the history of Iran all the way from ancient times to 1979. To summarize what we went over, one, I mentioned that Iran used to be a powerful empire, either ancient Persian ancient times or for a while the Safavid Empire in more early modern times. Two, I mentioned that in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, Iran went through a period of decline when it became a plaything for more powerful empires like Britain, the US, or Russia. And three, I mentioned that Iran in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, under the rule of the Shah, tried to modernize under an authoritarian regime by focusing on the development of oil and adopting Western values, at least when it came to capitalism, not so much when it came to democracy. That eventually led to great economic inequalities in Iran and also a complaint on the part of more fundamentalist people that Iran was giving rights to women in a way that was not traditional in Iran, and also on the part of people that would have been more pro-democratic. There were complaints that the Shah of Iran was rather authoritarian. So all that led to the 79 revolution, where the Shah was ousted and sent eventually to the US. With a big question being, well, where does Iran go now? Will it embrace a pro-Western democratic model, or go back to its fundamentalist Muslim roots? The situation was quite in flux for a while, except that the Muslim fundamentalist group was better organized and was able to kind of seize the day. Specifically, a man called the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Ayatollah is just a title. He was a high cleric in the Muslim Shiite religion. He actually had lived in exile for much of the 70s, specifically in my home country, France. He lived outside of Paris. But he would have contact with his supporters back in Iran by sending sermons that were taped on little audio tapes like we used to have in the 70s. And that's how he could develop supporters in Iran. And I always found it strange that people that are all about turning the clock back to the year 700, because they have a very conservative bent in their ideology, use modern technology, like in that case audio tape, to achieve their political goals. But I digress. Anyway, the Ayatollah Khomeini came back to Iran after the 79 revolution, and he and his supporters were able to kind of hijack the revolution, push out the more pro-democratic camp, and turn Iran into what it is today, an Islamic republic. Republic in the sense that they no longer have a Shah, you now have an elected president, and Islamic because it has to conform to the laws of Sharia, Muslim law. So it has changed quite a bit in Iran, because you take whatever policy was used by the Shah before and you kind of turn it completely 180. The Shah of Iran used to produce oil in partnership with American and British oil companies. Well, now all those oil companies would be nationalized under the Islamic Republic. And to the present time, Iran is still a major oil producer, but that is done by a national company. There used to be a very pro-Israeli policy under the rule of the Shah, and now there's a complete 180 when the new regime in Iran will become strongly anti-Israel. And presidents in Iran have been known for being Holocaust deniers or making comments about destroying Israel, which is kind of threatening, especially since they want to develop the nuclear bomb. They also support Hezbollah, which is a Shiite terrorist group in Lebanon that has a history of lobbing rockets at Israel and the like. There used to be a secular regime in Iran under the Shah, where religion would not govern everyone's life, while the Muslim fundamentalist party that took over after 79 would also do 180 on that, where now Sharia would be in charge, which had a lot of impact just in the legal case. Before that, the Quran was not part of the law. Now it is. You can actually flip through the Quran and just use what is in that religious text as the actual source of civil law. That has a lot of impact for maybe women. If you look at the way divorce proceedings are regulated in the Quran, they're not equal to between men and women. For a man to divorce a wife, it's pretty easy. All you have to do is publicly say, I divorce you 3 times, and that's it. You saved yourself a lot of money on lawyer fees, you are divorced. if a wife wants to divorce her spouse. However, it is far more complicated and sometimes impossible. So a lot of women that might have been able to dress the way they wanted and wear miniskirts in Tehran and drink alcohol and go to university now might not have the same opportunities. Even just playing soccer or going to a stadium where there are males in the stands as spectators can be difficult for women nowadays. Generally, there is a desire to make Iran more closely aligned with the precepts of the Quran. Which means rooting out all the westernizations. So movies like, I don't know, Rambo or The Godfather or whatever was playing in the movie theater in the 1970s tend to be pushed out as being examples of foreign domination. Whatever music might come out of the US, that's just perverted American pop culture, especially if it's 1970s, the disco era, the Village People. They're homosexual on top of that. Homosexuality would also be banned. If you have a bar that was serving American whiskey, that's gone too, or any kind of alcohol for that matter. So root out every bit of Western culture. To enforce that, there will be a special police for the prevention of sin and the preservation of virtue. That's a very, very long title. But think of it as like the morals police of Iran. Their goal is not to fight crime per se, but just to make sure that people follow the religious norms of the Quran. So that means maybe going through the street and looking at women and making sure they do wear a veil, whether they want to or not, and that it's hiding enough of the hair, or they don't have too much lipstick on. Or if they're going out and there's a man next to her, you ask, is that man your brother? No. Is that your father? No. Is that your legal guardian? No. So what are you doing with an unattached man in the street? And I'm not talking about fornicating in the middle of the street, not just walking out, going on a date with a person of interest. That would be forbidden by itself. So it's a big step down in availability of opportunities for women in Iran. Especially since you go back to the law of the Quran, which were designed in the 7th century, so quite archaic for the present day time. So things like chopping off the hands of people who are thieves, or stoning to death women who are convicted of adultery, things that seem very, very archaic, still practiced because, well, that is Sharia. So a very sharp divide between the pre and the post 1979. There is also a sharp divide in the history of US relations with Iran, where under the Shah, the US and Iran will be joined at the hip, and things go downhill very fast after 79. Specifically, when the Shah of Iran was overthrown and he was diagnosed with cancer, so he went to the US to receive some treatment, the US welcomed him as being, well, a loyal ally that was just sick. Well, the people in Iran were not too happy with that because they wanted him extradited back to Iran so that they could answer for the crimes that he had committed as Shah of Iran. So angry were the people in Iran that a few young students went and attacked the US embassy in Tehran, which normally is a big diplomatic no-no. No matter how poor your relations are with another country, you never attack their embassy. It's hallowed ground. Well, they did it anyway, and then took diplomatic personnel hostage. That's starting the hostage crisis of Tehran in 79, 80, 81. If you're too young, you might not remember that story at all, but if you're old enough to have lived through those times, it was a big story. Every night on the nightly news, there would be a story of those hostages being there, and for 100 days, 101 days, and 102 days, people would keep track of how long they had been there. And Jimmy Carter spent a lot of efforts as president trying to get the rescue of those hostages. He even organized a rescue operation, like a military-style operation with helicopters, which ended up being a big fiasco. So it was seen as a sign of American decline during the period, and definitely not helping the relationship between the two countries. If you're interested in learning more about that particular episode, there's a great movie that won the Academy Award for Best Picture a few years back. It's called Argo, which focuses not so much on the hostages that remain hostage, but those that managed to sneak out at the last minute, and how they were eventually extradited out of the country. While we're on the topic of movie, I would also recommend a movie Not Without My Daughter, which is a bit older. It's from the 1980s. It's based on a true story of an American woman who married an Iranian, and I think it was before the 79 revolution, so it was very westward looking, and everything was going just hanky-dory until they went back to Iran to visit family, and I think that's around the time when the 79 revolution happened, so things go very conservative, and he goes back to his traditional roots and tries to enforce a more traditional vision of marriage on his American wife, who is not too pleased with that, eventually wants to have divorce, except she's now in Iran under the new laws applying to women, and if she wants to bring her daughter with her and bring her back to the US, it becomes quite complicated. Not Without My Daughter. That's the title of the movie. Again, about movies, I would also recommend watching some of the movies that come out of Iran, because it has a local industry that produces some very good movies every once in a while. It's not big blockbuster kind of superhero movies. It's not the budget for that. It's more simple stories shot in Tehran, but some of them are quite delightful. Getting back to weightier topics, the relationship between the United States and Iran did not improve even after the hostages were finally released in 1981 under the Reagan administration. Because Iran would sponsor Hezbollah, a terrorist group in Lebanon, the country of Iran itself was labeled a state sponsor of terror. In the 1980s, there was a major civil war in Lebanon, and it's a small country but very, very diverse. You have some Christians, you have some Jews, you have Muslims that are Sunni, that are Shiite, and the whole thing just broke down in the 70s and 80s. So one of the groups, Hezbollah, would be there to be part of the fighting for the Shiite faction, and it was getting its money from the oil money of Iran. To monitor the fighting, the United States sent a number of Marines to Beirut, and in 1983, as I recall, there was a major explosion in front of the Marine barracks that killed several hundred US Marines. And as it turned out, this was an operation done by the Hezbollah. So that obviously did not help a relationship between the United States and Iran. Adding to the mix, in the 1980s, you have the IranContra scandal, which is a very complicated scandal, so I'll try to keep it simple here. It's connected to two things at once. That's why it's complicated. Let's for a second go to Central America, where in the 1980s in Nicaragua, you had a communist regime in charge, that of the Sandinista in Nicaragua. And the Reagan administration, being very strongly conservative, would try to overthrow that regime by supporting a group called the Contra, that would be kind of right-wing guerrillas in Nicaragua trying to overthrow the communist government there. The Republican administration in the White House, Reagan was at odds with the Congress, which was governed by Democrats, and was very unwilling to continue meddling into the affairs of other countries. And so the Democrats in Congress told the Reagan administration, you cannot continue funding a guerrilla operation in Nicaragua, which is within the rights of Congress. They control the purse. That's their role under the Constitution. Well, the Reagan administration wanted to continue giving money to the Contras, so had to raise some funds somewhere else, and they did so by selling spare parts and weapons to Iran, even though Iran was a strong enemy of the US by then. But because most of the Air Force of Iran had been acquired under the Shah, they were equipped with American airplanes, and they needed spare parts and such to keep the Air Force operating. So secretly, the Reagan administration sold those weapons to Iran at a profit so that they could raise funds to arm the Contras in Nicaragua. I told you it's a bit complicated. But it is doubly illegal. You're helping an enemy of the US, Iran, and you're doing something to bypass the will of Congress in Nicaragua. When that came out, that was a major scandal, going maybe all the way back to the president. That was a big question back then. Did Reagan knew about it or not, in which case he could have been impeached. In the end, the Iran-Contra affair kind of fizzled, but it was a big deal for a while in the 1980s. Nowadays, we are well beyond that, but the US and Iran still have fairly poor relations. The big question nowadays is whether Iran can develop a nuclear bomb. They have tried to create a nuclear program, normally for electrical purposes, but there's a lot of talk that they might want to develop a nuclear bomb as well, which normally should be within their sovereign right to do as an independent nation, but you could see how the United States would be very much against it, since Iran is a big strategic rival with a history of sponsoring terrorist groups, of talking about destroying Israel. So that's one of the big goals of the US now, to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. How do you do that best? Do you have just a strategy of confrontation, or maybe more diplomacy? That depends on the president. The previous president, I'm taping this in 2019, Barack Obama had tried to do an agreement with Iran where they would lift economic sanctions against Iran, allow them to buy Boeing airplanes and such, in exchange for which they would have to abandon the nuclear program and allow foreign inspectors to come and double check that this had been done. The current administration under Donald Trump has kind of backtracked on that agreement and pursued more of a strategy of confrontation, which is more to punish Iran. But in that case, Iran has said, well, we'll go back to doing whatever we want. So that's kind of where we are right now. The situation is a bit in flux. What will happen in the future is up to you. I'm providing you the history, so you now know what happened in the past, and you can, when you join the ranks of the US government, decide what the future will be like. While I am on the topic of giving advice, why don't we get in business together and start manufacturing Israeli flags and American flags? Not for the US or Israeli markets, because those countries appreciate their flag and take good care of them, so they don't buy new ones, but to Iran, where every time there's a demonstration against Israel or the United States, flags are burnt, and I'm pretty sure people need to buy a new one. Just an idea if you want to get in business with me. But to answer the question we started off with, which is why is it that the US and Iran have such poor relations? Well, there's a list of grievances. Think of it as a divorce. Each side has strong words about the other side. On the American side, Iran is accused of having stopped being an ally after 1979, gone down on the rights of women, supported terror, taken American personnel hostage, talked about destroying Israel, and now tried to develop an atomic bomb. On the Iranian side, their complaint would be that the US meddled with the reign of Mossadegh in 1953, exploited the oil of Iran for many years, supported a tyrant, the Shah, that committed human rights abuses, and is kind of a degenerate country that does not follow the precepts set by Sharia and Muslim law, and is still trying to impose sanctions on Iran to prevent them from doing what they want when it comes to their nuclear program. You also know why all these people are getting into airplanes. Here is the Shah of Iran being overthrown in 1979 and getting into exile to the US. Here is the Ayatollah Khomeini coming out of exile from France to Iran, also in 1979. And here are the American hostages finally freed in 1981 and flying back from Tehran to the US. So that's where we are right now. Your job will be to be the divorce advisor, the mediator that brings the two of them together so that we can have what every Miss America wants, and that's world peace. See you next time.